Now, what about reading from a file? Well, this may come as a shock to you, but there is a class that we can use for reading from files, and this would be called the Stream Reader class. I know it's a very unique name, but this is what it's called. Stream Reader is the class that allows us to read content from files. So let me give you a simple example of how we would use it, and what you're going to see is it looks a lot like the Stream Writer class and Stream Writer objects. So here we'll create a variable called fr, and this is going to be a type stream reader, and then we would call the appropriate constructor. So we'll set this equal to new stream reader. Here we're going to assume that fn is the string that contains the file path, and once we've done this, then we can use the appropriate methods for reading the file. So we have all sorts of methods from the stream reader class that allows us to do this reading. I'll mention a couple different reading methods. There are a lot more than this, but these are the more commonly used ones. So we have a method called read to end, and this just simply reads all the contents of the file. It's not just one character, it's not one word, it's not one line, it's the entire file. So we can read the entire thing all at once. We also have the read method, and this will read a single character in the file. And if we call the read method again, it would read the next file. So it reads one character, and then it moves to the next one, but it doesn't read that character until we call read again. So the read method allows us to read one character at a time. And then we have read line, which allows us to read one line of the file, and then it would move to the next one. So it basically goes up to until it finds a new line character. And then the next time we call read line, it will read the next line in the file. Now, all three of these reading methods return a string. And this just means that we can create string variables and store the results of these methods. In fact, that's what we need to do, unless you just want to print directly the results of that method. So it's a good idea to create a string variable and have that store the result of whichever reading method that you do use. Now, there is another reading method that we can use, and it works just a little bit differently. This method is called peek, and this does read the next character just like the read method does. The only difference is it does not move to the next character. So if I keep calling peek several times, it's just going to keep returning the same character that it's currently at. It's not going to move to the next character unless we call the read method. Now, how is this useful? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say we're at the end of the file. Peek actually returns -1. So what this means is we could use this peek method to check to see if we're at the end of the file. So we would check to see, does peek return -1? If so, then we're at the end of the file. Otherwise, we can keep reading. Because if you try to read after you're at the end of the file, I'm pretty sure bad things are going to happen. If you remember, other languages have like an end of file character. So this -1 is similar to that end of file character. So the peek method is very useful in that case. Now we should also mention that we can use the using block for the stream reader parts just like we did for stream writer, but if we do not include a using block in our code, we would have to call the close method for the stream reader object. For similar reasons, where if we do not close the file after trying to read it, no other program would be able to access that file. So we open up the file for reading purposes, we have to close it, whether you use the close method or if you include everything in a using block. Unlike the stream writer object, before we can read from a file, before we can use the stream reader object and read from a file, we have to make sure the file does exist. And this is because if we try to read a file and it's not there, we're going to get the file not found exception. And that's just because the stream reader does not create a new file. It's really hard to read from a file that does not exist. So we do have to make sure that the file is there first before we try to read from it. So the way we do that is we have a method called exists, and this comes from the file class. And what we have to do is we must include the file path as an argument. And what this simply does is it returns true if the file exists. Now, if the file does not exist, then it's going to return false. So we would need to include this like in an if statement to say, if the exists method is true, then that means the file exists, so we can go ahead and open it up for reading purposes and read from it. Otherwise, we would display like an error message or something that says the file doesn't exist. Let me give you a simple example here. Since this is from the file class, we would have to have file in front of it. So we would do file.exists, and then we would pass the file name, whether you do it directly or through a variable. And this just simply returns true if the file is there, and it returns false if the file is not there. So here is an example of reading from a file that uses everything we've talked about so far. So we see here up top that we are checking to see if the file exists. So we have file.exists, and fn we're assuming is the file. So if that's true, then we're going to go inside the then portion where we would create the stream reader object. So then we would call new stream reader and pass the file name, so that gets stored in the fr. And then we're going to, in this particular example, display a message box that displays the entire contents of the file. So that's, remember, we have here the fr.read-to-end method, which reads everything in the file. So it would just display the entire contents in a message box. And then we have end using, which is equivalent to our close method. So this will automatically close the file once we get here. Now, if our file.exist method is false, then we see down here that we would display a message box that just simply says that the file does not exist. That way you would know that you tried to read a file that does not exist. There is another thing that we can do with files. Let's say we want to write at the end of an existing file, but we don't want to overwrite anything that's already there. We can do what's called appending the file, which simply takes care of that. How do we append a file? Well, in the file class, there is a method called append text that simply allows us to open a file, just like open the file for reading or writing. The only difference is we're opening it for appending purposes, which once again means we're going to write starting at the end of the file, so we don't overwrite anything that's already there. So let me give you an example of how this is done. So we can have something like FW as stream writer. So we're still going to be creating an object of the stream writer class. So that part remains the same. So when we do our initialization here, we set it equal to file.append text, and we pass the name of the file. Once again, since this is from the file class, we would have to say file dot that method. Now, the way this works is pretty similar to how we would open a file for writing purposes. If the file does not exist, it will create a new file. So we don't have to worry about checking to see if the file is already there. Now, if it already does exist, then we will be allowed to write to the file, but it'll start at the end of the file instead of the beginning of the file. Once we've done this, then we can use any of the existing stream writer methods such as write or write line to write to this file.